Mall manager kicks Elon Musk out over MAGA hat, but what happens next leaves everyone speechless. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon at Willow Creek Mall in Madison, Seattle. Families strolled along, children tugging on their parents' hands, and the faint aroma of pretzels and cinnamon wafted through the air. Just a typical day, until someone extraordinary walked in. A man in a scarlet red jacket and jeans walked through the automatic doors near the food court. His face was unmistakable, drawing curious glances from passers-by. He wore sunglasses, but it was the bright red hat with the bold MAGA logo that truly set him apart, contrasting starkly against the refined ambiance of the mall. Whispers spread like wildfire. Is that Elon Musk? A teenage boy near the fountain squinted, his phone already raised to take a picture. No way. He muttered while his friend, also recording, said, "Why would he be here?" Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered discreetly, watching, murmuring amongst themselves. The man seemed utterly unconcerned, casually strolling through the stores as if he had all the time in the world. He even paused at an electronics kiosk to examine a display of drones, his face unreadable behind the reflective sunglasses. Meanwhile, in the management office, Jack Williams, the mall manager, was wrapping up a routine meeting with his staff, known for his strict demeanor and commitment to maintaining the mall's friendly image. Jack was meticulous in enforcing the rules, and one of those rules was no political displays of any kind, especially in such a public space. A knock on the door interrupted the meeting. It was Nancy, one of the security supervisors. "Jack, you might want to come out here. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Jack asked, already rising from his seat, his fingers tightening slightly as he felt a sudden wave of tension. Nancy hesitated, her lips trembling a bit. "Elon Musk, or someone who looks a lot like him, is here, and he's wearing a MAGA hat." Jack blinked his eyebrows. "Furrow, you've got to be kidding me. I wish I was." Nancy replied, her eyes betraying her concern. Jack let out a sigh, teeth slightly clenched, as he grabbed his radio. "All right, let us handle this quickly." By the time Jack reached the main concourse, a small crowd had already formed. People craned their necks, whispering amongst themselves, phones capturing every moment. The man had moved into the bookstore, browsing a book titled "The Future We Build," ironically about artificial intelligence. Jack's jaw tightened, a pulse flickering at his temple as he approached his polished shoes clicking on the tiled floor. "Excuse me, sir." Jack began, his voice steady but firm. "Could I have a word with you?" The man turned slowly, lowering his sunglasses. The piercing blue eyes revealed themselves, causing the crowd to gasp softly. "Yes," the man replied, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. Jack glanced at the hat, his grip on his radio tightening, as if he needed something to anchor himself. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat or leave the PR, as we maintain a neutral environment here." The man raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing at the corner of his lips. "A neutral environment," he repeated. "That's right, sir." Jack replied, "Political attire can be divisive, and we strive to keep this space comfortable for everyone." The man's lips curled slightly into a faint smile. "Interesting policy," he said, unmoving, his posture steady, "but I have no intention of moving the hat." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, some people openly recording the interaction. Jack could feel the pressure of their stares, the phones capturing every word. Sweat began to beat on his forehead. His throat dry. "Sir, I'm asking you politely," Jack said, his voice trembling, slightly, teeth beginning to clench. "If you refuse to comply, I will have to call security." The man crossed his arms, the red hat catching the overhead light. "Do what you have to do," he said evenly, his gaze unwavering. Jack's hand hovered over his radio, frozen in hesitation, his breath quickening. The air seemed to grow heavier by the second. Jack's radio crackled as he called for additional security. By now the situation had drawn quite the crowd. Mothers with strollers had stopped. Teenagers were leaning over the railings on the second floor, and even the pretzel vendor had abandoned his cart to get a closer look. Almost everyone in the mall was holding up a phone, live streaming or snapping photos. Within moments, 2 uniformed security guards appeared, a tall, broad-shouldered guard named Ethan, positioned himself beside Jack, arms crossed. The other Mia was younger, her hands slightly trembling, her gaze shifting nervously between Jack and the man in the hat. The man stood as ground calm and composed. He didn't fidget or shift his feet. Planted firmly on the ground, his shoulders relaxed, his expression unreadable. Though a trace of amusement lingered, Sir Jack repeated his voice now, carrying more authority, his hands clenching into fists, his face reining slightly. "This is your final warning. Remove the hat or leave them all." The man looked at the guards, a flicker of challenge in his eyes, then turned back to Jack. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice steady, devoid of any emotion. Ethan, the guard nearest, stepped forward, his shoulders tensing, one hand raised slightly in a ready stance. "Then we'll have to escort you out. Escort me out just for wearing a hat." The man chuckled, his shoulders bouncing lightly as he laughed and shook his head. "Do you hear yourselves?" The crowd's murmurs turned into a louder hum, their voices growing more chaotic. Some people in the crowd shouted, "This is ridiculous. Let him wear the hat." A middle-aged man in a denim jacket standing at the edge of the group yelled, his voice raspy. "Yeah, Hyun, not hurting anyone," a young woman added, raising her phone higher to record her words, laced with defiance, but others held different opinions. "This is private property. They have every right to enforce their rules." A voice from the back argued, the tone heavy with determination. "It's not about the hat. It's about keeping politics out of public spaces." Someone else added, their voice calm yet firm. The man stepped forward slowly, his leather shoes tapping lightly against the tiled floor. Moving closer to Jack, his presence was commanding. His eyes locked onto Jack's without blinking, yet his demeanor remained non-threatening. "Tell me, Mr. Manager," his voice dropped lower, forcing Jack to lean into here, "is this really about the hat, or is it about who you think I am?" Jack's heart seemed to tighten for a moment. A sharp pang hit his chest, and his breath shortened. It was a pointed question, and Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him more than he had anticipated. He straightened up, his hands clenched tightly in an attempt to steady himself. "This isn't personal," Jack said, his voice strained, his lower lip pressing together. "Rules are rules. Rules are rules." The man repeated, his voice soft, almost as if he was talking to himself. He removed his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes that were eerily familiar. The crowd collectively exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath for far too long. A few people nearby gaped, their hands trembling, as they continued to hold their phones. Aloft, "Oh my God, it's really him," someone whispered loudly, their voice cracking with astonishment. "Elon Musk," a teenage girl screamed, her eyes wide, her mouth open in disbelief. The shout shattered the silence that had hung in the air. The man smiled faintly, his lips barely curling, but he neither confirmed nor denied. He simply stood there, his feet planted firmly as though nothing could move him. Letting the moment stretch, letting everyone draw their own conclusions, Jack could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck, the drops sliding down his spine, making his shirt stick uncomfortably to his skin. This was not what he had envisioned. When he took this job, he wasn't just managing a mall anymore. He was now at the center of a volatile situation, spiraling out of control. "I'm asking you again," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly, his hands fidgeting restlessly as though searching for stability. "Will you take off the hat or leave?" The man's smile faded, his expression turning more serious. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if considering something, then spoke with a calm yet defiant tone. "No, Ethan." One of the security guards stepped forward, extending his hand as if to grab the man's arm. But the man took a step back, his eyes locked onto Ethan, unwavering, his voice rose just enough to cut through the noise of the crowd. "You're going to forcibly remove me. Go ahead, let the world see." The crowd erupted, a cacophony of voices filling the space. Some people raised their hands, cheering, excitement evident on their faces, while others gasped, their breaths caught in disbelief. Phones were held high, their lenses sweeping back and forth, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. A few voices shouted for the guards to back off, while others supported the mall's policies. Mia, the younger security guard, swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she looked over at Jack. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Jack hesitated, his eyes growing distant, as he weighed his options, his shoulders slumping under the pressure the situation had turned into a public relations nightmare. No matter what he did, someone would be upset, and this incident would undoubtedly flood social media by the end of the day. Before Jack could respond, the man raised a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd slowly quieted, all eyes fixated on him, as though waiting for something monumental. "Letun, not make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet resolve. He turned to Jack, his gaze unwavering. "But before you make your decision, maybe you should hear why I'm here." The crowd seemed to hold its breath, their eyes wide with curiosity, more drawn in than ever. Even Jack, though his patience was waning, couldn't help but listen. He felt his breath grow heavier, his throat dry. "Right," Jack said after a long pause, his chest rising and falling with conflicting emotions. "Go ahead, but if this is some kind of joke, you'll understand soon enough." The man interrupted, his voice radiating confidence, his eyes glimmering with a knowing light, as though he was certain his story would change people's minds. He clasped his hands together and took a step forward, his feet planted firmly, as if to assert his presence. His voice resonated just enough to command the attention of everyone nearby. "You all think this is about a hat." He began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, making eye contact with several people nearby. "But it's not. It's never been about that." The whispers immediately ceased, and the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. Phones remained held high, their lenses capturing every word, every expression. The crowd grew larger, spilling over from nearby hallways and shops. Some employees leaned against the end counters, eyes wide, while others stood at their store entrances, tilting slightly forward for a better view. The man turned toward Jack, gesturing gently, his hand lifting and then lowering slowly. "You're just doing your job, enforcing rules, maintaining order. I get that. But sometimes the rules we cling to end up doing more harm than good." Jack felt his chest tighten as if a heavy weight were pressing down on him. He clenched his teeth, his voice low, losing its patience. "Listen, I don't know what you're trying to say." The man raised his hand, palm open, as if to halt Jack's words, his voice calm but firm. The crowd responded with a collective gasp, some mouths hanging open, eyes widening. In surprise, Jack bit his lip, trying to keep his composure, crossing his arms over his chest, before motioning for the man to continue. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising slightly before he exhaled slowly. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, locking on a few curious gazes. "Imagine this." He began, his eyebrows lifting slightly for emphasis. "You see someone walking down the street wearing something you don't like. Maybe it's a hat, maybe it's a shirt, or maybe it's just the way they look. You feel uncomfortable, and you decide that they shouldn't be allowed in your space." The man paused, his sharp gaze piercing through the crowd, emphasizing each word. "You tell yourself it's about principles, about protecting others from discomfort. But really, it's about fear. Fear of what they represent. Fear of what you don't understand." His words were like a cold wind blowing through the space, causing many to shiver slightly. A few people in the crowd nodded subtly, while others shifted uneasily, their feet moving restlessly, their eyes darting away with unease. The tension in the air was almost tangible, with breaths becoming short and intermittent. Suddenly a voice cut through the silence. "But why the hat? Why here?" It was the voice of a young woman in a striped shirt, her eyes wide and fixed on the man, her phone held tightly, its lens focused directly on him. The man smiled slightly, the smile fleeting, his eyes softening in acknowledgement of the question. "Good question," he said, glancing at the girl. "I'll get to that. But first," he turned back to Jack, his voice low but clear. "Tell me, Mr. Manager, what do you think people are really afraid of when they see this hat?" Jack hesitated, his lips pressing together tightly. He was caught off guard by the question, and he felt his heartbeat quicken, sweat beginning to form at his temples. "It's not about fear," he said carefully, his voice dry. "It's about keeping this mall neutral. As I've said, Politics don't belong here." The man raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing, then he let out a gentle breath, relaxing slightly. "Neutral. Huh, interesting concept, but neutrality isn't silence. It's action letting people coexist, even when it's uncomfortable." The crowd began to murmur again, their voices swelling like the sound of waves. A few people clapped softly, their palms meeting with quiet but resonant slaps, while most still looked around at each other, their faces filled with uncertainty. Nancy, the security supervisor, quickly approached Jack, her eyes looking at him urgently. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "We're trending on Twitter." Nancy showed him her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed at the hash memol, gaining traction with thousands of views from multiple live streams. Jack sighed, the throbbing at his temples causing him to rub them lightly to ease the pain. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, his eyes closing for a brief moment before opening again, staring into the distance as if seeking a solution. "I can't just let this go." The man, seemingly reading the tension etched across Jack's taut face, stepped forward once more, the sound of his shoes tapping firmly against the tiled floor. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his gaze shifting to address the entire crowd, his eyes glowing with determination. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came here for a reason, and yes, this hat is part of it, but it's not the reason you all think." The murmurs grew louder, the crowd's excitement spreading as they exchanged glances, their eyes lit with curiosity that now overwhelmed their earlier skepticism. Even Jack, fully aware of how the situation was escalating, found himself leaning in, unable to resist listening further. The anticipation made his back straighten slightly, his hands clenching into tight fists. "Why are you here?" someone shouted from the back, their voice hoarse with anxiety. "What's going on?" The man smiled faintly, his lips curling up slightly, but his eyes held something deeper, something heavy, like the unseen currents beneath a calm SE. "I'll tell you," he responded, his voice carrying the weight of an important revelation. "But first, let me ask you this. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about someone changed in an instant? Would you listen, or would you shut them out just because of what they were wearing?" The question hung in the air, creating an invisible pressure that weighed on the crowd. Some people turned their heads away, their shoulders tinned in discomfort. Others leaned forward, their eyes wide, the spark of curiosity flaring bright, eager for the answer. Jack opened his mouth to respond, his lips trembling slightly, but before he could speak, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up, his eyes locked onto the crowd, his expression turning more serious. "This," he said slowly, unfolding the paper, his fingers gliding along its creases, "is why I'm here." The crowd surged forward, many leaning in, straining to get a better look. Phones zoomed in, screens lighting up as they tried to capture every detail of the crisp document in his hand. Jack's stomach twisted, his body ensing, his eyes narrowing, as he tried to make out the writing on the paper. "What is it?" someone shouted, their voice echoing through the crowd. The man's face softened, his eyes filling with something warm, his voice lowered, compelling everyone to lean in closer to hear. "It's a letter," he said, each word spoken clearly, "from a young woman who works here. She wrote to me asking for help, and that's exactly why I'm here." The crowd gasped, their curiosity reaching a fever pitch. Some frowned, exchanging puzzled glances, but their phones remained steady, capturing every second Jack stepped closer, his arms crossed defensively over his chest, his shoulders rising like a barrier. "A letter. What does that have to do with you or this situation?" The man unfolded the paper fully, his fingers smoothing the creases, his eyes briefly scanning the words before looking back up at the crowd. His voice softened, carrying a genuine sincerity. "This letter is from a young woman named Emily." He said she's 21 years old, works at the food court, and dreams of going to college one day. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. In the distance, a young woman wearing a green apron stood, frozen, her legs stiff. The tray of napkins in her hands shook violently, her face turning pale, as if the blood had drained from her body upon hearing her name. "Oh no," she whispered, her hands trembling, her fingers gripping the tray as if searching for stability. The man continued, his voice steady and gentle. She wrote to me. Because her mother's medical bills are crushing her family, she works 2 jobs just to help keep things afloat, and despite everything she's been through, Emily is still saving up for community college. The atmosphere in the crowd shifted instantly. The initial tension and confrontation gave way to a deep, resonant silence. Shoulders relaxed, and an air of empathy seemed to ripple across the space. Jack felt the tightness in his stomach ease, replaced by an uncomfortable confusion that made his chest ache. "But what does this have to do with you?" Jack asked, his voice softer, now lacking the sharpness it had before. "Why did she write to you?" The man smiled slightly, his eyes meeting Jack's directly, filled with determination. "Because she believed I could help." He replied simply. He raised the letter again, turning towards the crowd, his hands steady, unwavering. "Emily didn't just send this to anyone. She sent it to me, Elon Musk. And yes, I am who you think I am." The crowd erupted like a volcano, some people gasping for breath, others raising their hands to their mouths in shock, phones aimed directly at his face, flashes blinking as they compared every detail of this man to the image they had seen on TV and in the news. Countless times a teenage boy shouted, "I told you it was him," while another muttered, "No way, this is insane." Jack, who had always been calm, felt himself faltering. His hands dropped limply to his sides as he stared at the man, now unable to deny that this was indeed Elon Musk. He struggled to process what was happening, like an overloaded computer trying to make sense of too much information. "Wait," what Jack stammered. His lips dry, almost unable to find his breath. Musk chuckled softly, his shoulders shaking slightly as he did. And then he shook his head. "You all didn't believe me before, and I understand that this isn't exactly a normal day at the mall." He turned back towards the crowd, his stance firm and his voice gaining strength with an unmistakable sincerity. "Emily's letter moved me. She didn't ask for money. By the way, she asked for advice on how to balance her dreams with the burden her family carries. She thought maybe I could give her some guidance." Emily stood frozen behind the soda machine, her back pressed against it, as though it were the only thing holding her up. Her face flushed, her hands queued around her face, but the crowd had already seen her. Minnie turned to look, fingers pointing, whispering, making her feel as if all eyes were now on her. Emily Musk called out gently, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on her. His voice was soft, yet unmistakably clear. "You don't have to hide. Come here." Emily hesitated, feeling her heart pounding furiously, each beat like a hammer against her ribcage. Her co-workers around her encouraged her, nudging her forward with soft words. She stepped out from her hiding place, her hands trembling, her green apron still tied around her waist, her steps unsteady. The crowd parted, creating an open path for her. Musk smiled warmly, his eyes glowing with sincerity as he held the letter out to her. "You were brave to write this letter," he said, his voice lowering, "and you were right. I want to help." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide, her lips quivering before she managed to speak, her voice catching in her throat. You really read it?" she stammered, almost choking on her words. "I didn't think anyone would read it." "I did," Musk said firmly, his eyes unwavering, staring directly at Emily. "And I came here today because I wanted to meet you in person." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes, her throat tightening. She drew a deep breath, her eyes glistening as she looked at Musk. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small and trembling. "Why would you care about someone like me?" Musk placed his hand on Emily's shoulder, his touch warm and firm, his voice filled with determination. "Because people like you are the reason I do what I do. You are the future, and you deserve a chance to build something incredible." The crowd began to applaud, the clapping echoing steadily, some wiping tears from their eyes, their shoulders shaking as they watched this poignant moment unfold. Even Jack began clapping his hands, hesitant at first, but soon joining in, caught up in the moment. Despite the lingering discomfort somewhere deep inside, Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand trying to steady her breathing, her voice shaky. "But I don't know what to do next. I'm just trying to survive." Musk smiled, his eyes shining with resolve. "We start with this." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you. Consider it an investment in your future." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands, nearly unable to hold on to it. She opened it carefully, her eyes widening, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes scanned the number. Inside, she gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth, holding back a sob. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity, eager to know what the check contained. Emily's voice cracked as she whispered, her lips quivering, her hands shaking slightly. It's $50,000. The applause erupted again, even louder. This time, many shoulders shook with emotion as people cheered and whistled. The tension of moments ago swept away. By the humanity of this gesture, the mall filled with cheers and applause. A stark contrast to the tense atmosphere of just minutes before. Emily stood still, clutching the envelope tightly, as if it were the only lifeline she had. Her co-workers rushed over, patting her on the back, their arms wrapped around her in warm congratulations. The crowd buzzed with energy, camera flashes flickering as everyone sought to capture this once-in-a-lifetime moment. Jack approached slowly and cautiously, his eyes fixed on Musk. The professionalism he had tried to maintain battled fiercely with the emotions of the moment. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Musk," his voice now softer, lacking the stiffness it had earlier. I didn't know about the situation." If I had Musk turned his eyes sharp, his face serious, but without hostility. "You didn't know, because you didn't ask." Musk's voice was sharp enough to make Jack flinch, his legs stiffening, his gaze dropping slightly. "You saw a hat and made a judgment. I understand rules are rules, but sometimes those rules need to bend for the right reasons." Jack nodded, his throat dry, and a feeling of shame washed over him, seeping into his veins as Musk's words echoed in his mind. "You're right," Jack admitted, his voice growing quieter. "I was too focused on enforcing the rules to see the bigger picture. I apologize." Musk's expression softened, his lips curling into a small smile. He nodded, apology accepted. "Just remember, people aren't defined solely by what they wear or the opinions they hold. Sometimes it's worth taking a moment to understand the person behind the appearance." The crowd murmured in agreement, with some nodding gently, their eyes downcast as they reflected on what had just transpired. Musk turned back to Emily, his smile returning, his eyes lighting up with encouragement. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "Use this opportunity to chase your dreams, and when you have the chance to help someone else, pay it forward." Emily wiped her tears, her hands trembling slightly, fingers tightening as she tried to steady herself. Her voice quivered as she responded, "I will, I promise," as the crowd began to disperse. The energy of the event shifted as well. Phones were still capturing the moment, sharing and discussing it in real time, creating waves across social media platforms. News outlets quickly picked up the story, describing it as an unexpected and deeply humane gesture from one of the world's most famous figures. Back in his office, Jack sank into his chair, his back pressing against the cushions, as though seeking comfort. He scrolled through Twitter, his eyes widening, his face paling, as he read the comments. Most praised Musk for his gesture and commended Emily for her courage, but a fair number also criticized Jack's actions, accusing him of being rigid and biased. Jack sighed, his shoulders drooping as he felt the sting of public opinion. Amidst the negative comments, one line stood out to him. "Sometimes we all need a reminder to see the humanity in one another. Lesson learned today, let'n do better." Jack read and reread that line, his gaze softening, finding a small bit of solace amidst the sea of criticism. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, the check still in her hands, her eyes fixed on the number, as if she couldn't quite believe it, her mother frail. But her eyes filled with pride, smiled, reaching over to take her daughter's hand, her own hands wrinkled but warm and reassuring. "You've always been a fighter," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "and now you have a chance to do something incredible." Emily nodded, her eyes shining with renewed determination, her chest swelling with a sense of purpose. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope, a real, tangible hope, stronger than ever before. Meanwhile, Elon Musk left the mall as unassumingly as he had arrived. He walked with a calm demeanor, declining interviews, waving at fans, then quietly slipping away without any further spectacle. But his actions left a lasting impact, not just on Emily, but on everyone who witnessed the day's events. The next morning, the management of Willow Creek Mall issued a public apology for the incident, promising to review their policies to ensure a more inclusive environment. Jack himself drafted the statement, his hands trembling slightly as he typed each word. Pledging to approach his role with greater empathy, and understanding, moving forward, the story became an online sensation, spreading across the country, sparking discussions about judgment, compassion, and the power of small acts of kindness. Emily's story inspired many to share their own struggles, leading to waves of support and community-driven initiatives. In the end, what began as a confrontation over a hat transformed into something far greater, a reminder of the humanity that connects us all, even in the most unexpected places. How do you feel about Emily's story and Elon Musk's actions at Willow Creek Mall? Share your thoughts in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, your voice will inspire someone out there, spark compassion, and drive positive change. Thank you for taking the time to watch and support. Let's work together to make the world a better place. One small action, one open heart at a time. Wishing you hope and love. All will see you in the next video.